The Zapper itself has quite the interesting design. The initial American version was space gray with a long, exaggerated barrel and a sleek, futuristic look. This differed greatly from its Japanese counterpart, which looked to be a realistic replica of a Colt-action revolver straight out of a Western. The reasoning for these design differences is multifaceted. First off, the lack of guns seen in Japan made a replica seem novel by comparison, while in America, this could be quite dangerous. If a kid's parents owned a gun, for instance, there is a non-zero chance that they could confuse the replica with the actual firearm, leading to a relaxed sense of danger around the weapons, or, worst case scenario, injury to property or themselves. In addition, Nintendo is really trying to push the imaginary side of the Zapper. By designing it similarly to Rob, copying many of the colors and soft edges of its robot buddy, they could convince parents and children that the device would have function outside of gaming. If they remained tied down to a replica of a revolver from the 1800s, it's safe to say that they may have had to change their angle to marketing in the United States. Gun peripherals had actually been seen before in the gaming industry, a few times. The Magnavox Odyssey's Shooting Gallery was the first game that included a light gun peripheral, released in 1972. Its pack-in was just a bit too similar to a rifle, something that would be copied by countless manufacturers in the 70s and up until the early 80s. While Nintendo's American design was far from realistic, it was forced to conform to a color change when, in 1988, the federal toy gun law was passed. There had been a rise in police shootings involving toy guns that looked too real. The statute required manufacturers to add obvious colors to guns in order to curb any danger that could stem from toy misidentification. Its gray styling was replaced with bright orange in 1989, as can be seen in the NES Action Set and beyond. By this point, popularity in the device had faded, and the Zapper, and certainly not Rob, were no longer the selling points for the console. Nevertheless, it had certainly done its job with its time in the spotlight, starting with 3 1985 games in the Light Gun series. Speaking of, let's continue our exploration with the second of the three. The Rootin, the Tootin, the Pointin', and the Shootin', Hogan's Alley. Out of all of the Light Gun series games available at the NES's launch, Hogan's Alley and Wild Gunman didn't stand out too much from one another. While Duck Hunt was full of colorful, lively characters, from the background to the character design, these two games had a similar aesthetic to them. Wild Gunman was set in the Wild West, a place filled with bandits and earth tones. Meanwhile, Hogan's Alley was populated with a similar crowd of criminals, instead portrayed as gangsters according to the game's lore. The difference in these sprites was quite minimal, however, and lacked the cartoony charm that Miyamoto was no doubt a part of creating with Duck Hunt. This carried over to gameplay as well. The first two game modes of Hogan's Alley had very similar objectives to Wild Gunman. Shoot the bad guys before they shoot you. I'll get more into Wild Gunman in the next chapter, but for now, I'll reiterate that, outside of the third game mode in Hogan's Alley, the two games had very few differences. Hogan's Alley was based on a special police training school by the same name. Game Mode A gave the player a list of 6 characters, 3 gangsters and 3 good guys, including a policeman, a librarian, and a lady. They would have to quickly react to sets of 3 cutouts of randomized characters, shooting only the gangsters in the allotted time while avoiding the good guys. Similar to Duck Hunt's Game Mode A, it served as the introduction to the meteor sections. Game Mode B involved an on-rails shooter through its mock town with a similar goal: shoot the gangsters as fast as possible and avoid hitting civilians or allies. The difficulty in both of these modes arose in the similarities between sprites. While the woman was a bit difficult to confuse for a gangster, the librarian's red hat looked similar to Gangster A's red hair, and the policeman's black outfit and hat looked similar to Gangster C's and Gangster B's, respectively. The other difficulty lay within the actual aiming of the gun, at least in Game Mode B. There is a fair amount going on screen at any given moment, so in addition to identifying bad guys as quickly as possible, the player would also have to be quite the sharpshooter. Hogan's Alley's Game Mode C, Trick Shot, is where the title really distinguishes itself from the other Light Gun series games. The premise is simple: shoot the cans into different gaps on the left in order to get the highest score possible. Up to 3 cans at a time can appear on screen, and when the player is forced to juggle all of them at once, it does get pretty difficult. Even though this mode doesn't feature any high-stakes shootouts or intense action shots, its simple charm is enough to provide a good amount of fun to those who got sick of the repetitive earlier game modes. As with many black box games, the gameplay isn't very deep. All of the sub-games are high-score based and relatively limited in scope. However, Nintendo was still able to take inspiration from Hogan's Alley in future titles. Several mini-games from the WarioWare series featured cameos from Hogan's Alley, including a Shoot the Villains, Spare the Innocents game in Mega Microgames. The final boss of WarioWare Touched's 9-volt stage is based on the Trick Shot game mode, in which the player has to juggle cans continuously. This concept was also adapted to Wii Play's shooting range minigame, in which the player would have to juggle cans by shooting them repeatedly, gaining points the longer they're kept in the air. Once again, Nintendo modernized their old IPs, bringing attention back to their roots in America. By revamping light gun games to work with 2006 motion control technology, they were able to bring back the charm that the original titles delivered in 1985. Like the other light gun games, Hogan's Alley was also brought back on the Wii U eShop, featuring motion controls as a stand-in for the Zapper. Hogan's Alley's Game Mode B was also one of the first rail shooters to really take off. The genre, characterized by limiting the player's movement options, instead relegating them to wait for the camera to reveal enemies, would see a massive increase in popularity in the mid-1990s, with games like Yoshi's Safari for Super Nintendo, Panzer Dragoon for PC and PlayStation 2, and House of the Dead, present in both arcades and consoles. While these titles certainly had a lot more going for them than Hogan's Alley did, it is undeniable that the popularity of the NES title, at the time, did pave the way for these games to follow. Although it did have some notable impact on future shooting games, when it came down to it, Hogan's Alley seemed as though the game was better suited for arcades. While Hogan's Alley topped arcade charts in 1985, ending as one of the highest grossing cabinets of the year, it never saw the same success on its console port. The high score based mechanics got old pretty fast, and, unlike Duck Hunt, in which you could essentially carry on forever, Game Mode B became virtually impossible quite quickly, as the speed needed to react to gangsters became inhuman as it progressed. The game hasn't aged poorly in terms of gameplay, but it certainly doesn't maintain its fun for long. While it may not be as iconic as Duck Hunt, Hogan's Alley did serve as a perfectly functional light gun game, padding the peripherals lineup nicely. And, well, it succeeded in that right.